The 7 Hidden Cracks. Inside Budget 2025, and why markets reacted in chaos. What unfolded around Budget 2025 was not simply a debate about tax rates, welfare spending, or fiscal rules. It was a moment where the machinery of the modern state briefly exposed its internal stress, revealing how fragile confidence becomes when growth slows, promises collide with arithmetic, and control over information slips away. The budget was supposed to be delivered in the Commons, framed carefully by the Chancellor, interpreted line by markets, and digested gradually by the public. Instead, it escaped containment. The accidental release of the Office for Budget Responsibility's full budget documentation, hours before the speech, fundamentally altered the dynamics of the day. By the time the Chancellor stood at the dispatch box, the narrative was no longer hers to shape. MPs had already read the numbers. Journalists had already written headlines. Traders had already begun reacting. The ritual that normally stabilizes fiscal announcements had broken down. This loss of narrative control matters more than it might appear. In modern economies, budgets are not only fiscal tools, they are credibility events. Markets do not just price policy, they price confidence in the system that delivers it. When that system falters, even briefly, volatility follows. At the heart of Budget 2025 was a stark reversal. A year earlier, the government had raised $40 billion in taxes while promising that no further tax rises would be necessary. Growth, it said, would do the rest. Working people would be protected. The economy would expand. The tax burden would stabilize. That promise did not survive contact with reality. Budget 2025 added another $26 billion in tax rises, pushing the overall tax burden toward an all-time high of 38% of GDP by the end of the parliament. This was not framed as ideological ambition. It was framed as inevitability. Living standards were rising more slowly than forecast. Welfare spending continued to increase. Productivity remained weak. The growth that was meant to ease fiscal pressure never fully materialized. As a result, the government returned to the only lever it could still pull: taxation. Inside government, the mood was defensive. One senior cabinet minister described the budget as an exercise in self-preservation rather than national renewal, a phrase that captured the underlying tension. This was not a budget designed to transform the economy. It was designed to stop the situation from deteriorating further. Political pressure shaped key decisions. The Chancellor lifted the 2-child benefit cap, a move long demanded by Labour MPs and popular within her party. Yet it was a decision opposed by a clear majority of the public, with around 60% against it. This exposed a widening gap between parliamentary priorities and public sentiment. At the same time, the budget targeted tax rises at higher earners through pension reforms and property-related measures. Symbolically, this reinforced the idea of fairness. Practically, the numbers told a different story. The largest revenue raiser was not a mansion tax or a levy on extreme wealth, but the continued freeze on income tax thresholds. That freeze alone was expected to raise more than $8 billion. It meant that as wages rose nominally, more people would be pulled into higher tax brackets, paying more without an explicit rate increase. Crucially, this measure directly contradicted a promise made by the Chancellor herself a year earlier, when she warned that freezing thresholds would hurt working people. The Commons' reaction was brutal. Opposition MPs accused the Chancellor of breaking every major pledge she had made. Some described the budget as a transfer from working households to welfare recipients. Calls for resignation followed almost immediately. The atmosphere was tense, hostile, and unusually personal. All of this unfolded against the backdrop of the leak. The accidental release of the budget documents from the OBR was unprecedented. Never before had the entire fiscal blueprint been made public hours early in this way. The result was confusion, not clarity. Markets reacted instantly. Government bond yields began to swing sharply. The 10-year gilt yield moved violently as traders scrambled to interpret the data without guidance. This was not a rational repricing of policy risk. It was a reaction to uncertainty itself. In normal circumstances, a chancellor raises taxes and markets respond within a familiar framework. Analysts listen to the speech, digest the tone, and assess credibility. This time, that framework collapsed. Traders were downloading documents before they were removed, racing against time, trying to understand whether the budget strengthened or weakened the public finances. The volatility itself became the story. Even as yields later settled and trended downward, the initial chaos had already sent a message. The system had shown how quickly confidence could wobble when information discipline failed. Beyond the spectacle, the underlying numbers painted a sobering picture. The Office for Budget Responsibility upgraded growth expectations for the current year, raising forecasts from 1% to 1.5%. On the surface, this appeared to validate the government's argument that the economy was stabilizing, but that optimism faded quickly when looking further ahead. Growth forecasts for the following years were revised downward across the board. The economy was now expected to grow more slowly for longer, with only modest recovery at the very end of the forecast horizon. This mattered enormously because growth underpins everything else. Slower growth means lower tax receipts, higher deficits, and less room to maneuver. It also means that fiscal fixes must rely more heavily on taxation rather than expansion. The deficit projections reinforced this concern. Contrary to expectations that borrowing would steadily decline, the deficit was now forecast to be higher in the first, second, and third years of the outlook. Only in the later years did the numbers improve, and even then, the improvement depended on measures scheduled far in the future. This raised familiar doubts among investors. Measures that only take effect in year 4 or 5 are always vulnerable to political change, economic shocks, or simple reversal. Credibility weakens the further projections stretch into the distance. At the start of the process, the Chancellor had $9.9 billion of headroom against her fiscal rules. Weaker growth erased $5.7 billion of that almost immediately. Faced with shrinking margins, the government responded by raising taxes aggressively to rebuild headroom and reassure markets. But taxation carries its own cost. Higher taxes dampen consumption, discourage investment, and weigh on growth. This creates a feedback loop. Weak growth demands higher taxes weaken growth further, and the cycle tightens. The distribution of the tax burden revealed another structural fault. While political rhetoric emphasized taxing wealth, many of the largest revenue measures hit ordinary households directly. Changes to pension tax relief through salary sacrifice were expected to raise $4.7 billion, affecting millions of workers depending on how their schemes were structured. Electric vehicle taxes rose sharply, even as fuel duty remained frozen, raising uncomfortable questions about incentives and environmental coherence. Property and savings taxes increased. Gambling taxes rose. Meanwhile, the much-discussed mansion tax raised just $400 million, a negligible sum in the context of the overall package. The contrast between headline politics and fiscal reality was stark. Symbolic measures dominated the debate, while structural revenue came from quiet, broad-based changes that affected the majority. Yet the most damaging aspect of Budget 2025 was not any single tax or forecast. It was the collapse of narrative authority. Because the budget had been leaked, the Chancellor never had the chance to frame her choices as strategic, necessary, or forward-looking. Instead, she appeared reactive, defensive, and constrained. The Commons sensed it. Markets sensed it. The public sensed it. What should have been a moment of authority became a moment of exposure. Budget 2025 did not trigger a crisis, but it revealed the conditions under which crises emerge. High taxes, weak growth, rising welfare costs, shrinking fiscal headroom, and fragile confidence form a dangerous combination. The market reaction was not a verdict on the budget itself. It was a response to instability in the system that delivers policy. When credibility, control, and communication fracture at the same time, even briefly, the foundations of trust are tested. That is why Budget 2025 matters, not because it failed outright, but because it showed how thin the margin for error has become. In moments like this, the lesson is not about ideology, it is about structure. Systems do not collapse when one decision goes wrong. They collapse when stress accumulates quietly, promises outrun capacity, and confidence is lost faster than it can be restored. Budget 2025 was not the end of stability, but it was a warning signal, and markets reacted accordingly.